Recording in progress. Okay, it's on gallery view.
Perfect. Stephanie.
To sip my tea.
Enjoy.
I'm so excited about this.
Me too.
So, do you want to introduce yourself for
the masses? Sure.
Tell them all the amazing things you do. You're here for astrology, but you are a complex human being. Tell me more.
I'm John Patterson. Stephanie and I have known each other for over half our lives. We went to high school together.
Wild.
And I am an astrologer, as Stephanie mentioned. I see clients for birth chart readings and also predictive astrology. In addition to astrology, I'm predominantly a playwright. I also dabble in other genres. I've written like poetry and essays and songs, which I can't sing. So the songs are essentially poems that I imagine as songs. And I do other things. I am getting into burlesque. And
I was waiting to hear that one.
I am a Swiftie, for any Swifties out there. That feels like a pretty important part of my life. Yeah, little bits and pieces of me everywhere.
Well, so you're here to talk about astrology, though. Mm-hmm. So
you're like, focus on one.
Let's focus on one right now. So how did it all begin? What like piqued your interest with astrology? And like, how long ago was that? I feel like that was how many years ago? I don't even know.
That was like 5 years ago now.
Okay.
I would say I've always kind of like, I don't know that I've ever told you this, but
tell everyone now.
At various points in my life, like I've been interested in it. And actually, when we were in high school, at one point I was writing like a script for what I envisioned as a TV pilot, and I was trying to like shape all the characters. And I'd gotten this like astrology book for young people at the library, and was like trying to figure out what each character's sign would be to try and develop them. But in terms of like getting deeper than like sun sign astrology, that started more around 2017. And it was like it started with the official story.
I love where this is going.
It started with the eclipse in Leo, the big solar eclipse where we could watch it with the goggles.
I still remember that on the beaches, like I went to the beach with my mom, and everyone was like looking up, and yeah, I'm just like, you're burning your eyes.
Yeah, I was working at a library at the time. We were giving out goggles where you could watch it safely. And it was like the day of that eclipse, our phone didn't stop ringing. I wanted to crawl in a hole and die. But I was like, sure. And also it was a time of like transition in my life. Like I had just produced my first play and was sort of trying to figure out what was going to happen next. And I was like, I feel like if the moon blocks out the sun for a period of time, that has to do something to our psyche. So I was Googling like, what is the effect of an eclipse on your psychology? And the only thing that was coming up was astrology. So I was like, all right, I guess I should learn more about this. And then dove more into my birth chart and all the different pieces of it. And all of it felt true and resonant. And then did it for my friends. And all of that felt true and resonant as well. And just, I have a tendency when I get interested in something to get like obsessive about it. And really just
I can attest.
Really just like dove in and was like, I'm gonna learn every little like nuance of this that I can. And then started learning more and more and started seeing clients in like middle of 2020.
Okay, now I'm interested because you like pointed out that eclipse. You said it was in Leo?
Yeah.
Interesting. So like speaking from an astrological perspective, like that finally woke you up to there must be something to this. So do you want to talk about how that could be explained by
My birth chart.
by the birth chart, by the eclipse in Leo in that moment. Like, what was that affecting in your chart that it was like?
Well, I am a Leo. So that,
See,
and also
I have to make sure that gets thrown in here. Like, tell me how this Leo
tell me how this Leo eclipse affects you as a Leo. Who probably would like to talk about the fact that you were a Leo. So yeah, it was the sun sign is like the ego and the way you see yourself, and so I think I was conscious of that too. Like the eclipse, once I started seeing that like the thing that most explained how an eclipse could affect our psychology was astrology, and finding out that the eclipse was going to be in Leo, I was like, well, I'm a Leo, so that made me more like even more interested of like, would this have a specific effect on me? Because it would be like amplifying a part of my ego, and it wasn't necessarily that like that eclipse was very close to my birthday or anything, but Leo is my 6th house of like work and daily habits, so that's actually kind of interesting, and the fact that like astrology has become part of my work but didn't for many years, but I thought of it at the time as just like a period of, because eclipses happen over a series, so for a year and a half eclipses happen in the same pair of signs, it would be Leo and Aquarius, and sort of this period of time of awakening something new in my ego. And I was also wondering, like, I was waiting to find out about a festival for the play, and was thinking I was going to find out around that time. And I was like, what if I found out the day of the eclipse? Then astrology is like really true. And nothing happened the day of the eclipse. I remember like sitting in my room, like depressed, while everybody else was out burning their eyes. And then the next day I realized I had missed a voicemail, and they had left the voicemail that I'd gotten into the festival on the day of the eclipse.
John.
Which is actually funny because the eclipse is all about like something you can't see, the moon blocking out the sun. So something was happening that I didn't see at the time until the next day.
I feel like I must have known this when it was happening, but it was before because I learned everything I know essentially about astrology from you, like by just absorbing and
being spoken to about it nonstop. When I'm obsessed with something, it's also important to me that everybody else be obsessed with it.
And me repeatedly asking you the same questions, and you patiently answer, Stephanie, no. That's not what it is. So I'm curious to know, what do you think is the biggest misconception about astrology? Like, what's something you were surprised to discover from astrology? Something, let's talk about that.
I mean, I think it's interesting because I think it's changed over the time period that I've been interested in it, because I think that like there's been this like big resurgence of like it's increased in popularity, and people's like knowledge about it has increased. And I was sort of becoming interested in it right at the beginning of that happening culturally. And I think at that point when I was starting to get interested in it, the biggest misconception was that like, oh, it's just your sun sign, and that like sun sign horoscopes. I think this is still a big mistake that people make, is like reading horoscopes for their sun sign, because most horoscopes are cast for the house system. And the house system are basically like different parts of your life. And it starts with your first house, which is your rising sign, which is the house of the self. So like I'm a Leo, but my rising sign is Pisces. So if I read a horoscope for Leo, like right now when Libra season, it's going to be like, oh, things are happening in your 3rd house of community, because math, Libra is the 3rd house from Leo. But as a Pisces rising in Libra season, like things are actually more happening in my 8th house of like sexuality and finances and those sorts of topics. So I think sometimes people can read horoscopes and resonate with parts of it just because they're catered towards the personality qualities of their sun sign, but not necessarily resonate with the actual details that are happening in their lives and be like, oh, this doesn't really have much value. Which again, it's not necessarily, even reading for your rising sign, like it's not dealing with the specifics and the ins and outs of your chart. The biggest misconception I think people have now is like people know more. I think it's the idea that there are like bad transits, because I think that ultimately every transit is good for something. And like the good thing about astrology, I guess I should specify a little bit about what a transit is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who's gonna watch this. I don't know if they're seasoned in
I have a really bad habit of speaking like well, this is also I think because also this is the way I like to learn, where like people just sort of like talk about it as if I already know, and then I just like have to catch up, but I know that not everybody learns that
the
way.
context clues.
Yeah. So if I do this, please interrupt me.
I mean, honestly, John, like in the beginning when you were talking to me about astrology, there were so many moments I'm just nodding. I'm just not, I'm taking it. I caught this word, transit, Jupiter. Like that's and you're just going on it. And that's how I learned though. That's how I ended up learning.
Yeah, but I don't know that these people have this much time. We spend a lot of time together.
Yeah. There are many, many hours.
So transits are essentially, you have your birth chart. I guess I'll do a short astrology summary. You have your birth chart, which is basically where all the planets were the moment that you were born. The only people that have the exact birth chart as you would literally be someone that is born at the exact same time, at the exact same place as you. Like even twins don't have the exact same birth chart because they're born a few minutes apart. So it is very specific to each individual person, but there can be similarities with other people. And then when the planets are always moving through the sky, and as they move, they might make interactions with where the planets are in your birth chart. So like our birthdays are literally when the sun are in the exact same place as it was when we were born. It's a solar return. But then, for example, they can also be at the opposite place. So then it's opposing your sun. And what does that do? Where the sun is now opposes where your sun is. So transits that's essentially what a transit is. And you can use transits to like make predictions, not necessarily about exactly what events will happen, but sort of the energy that you're going to be dealing with and like what part of your life you might be dealing with it in. So people who know more about astrology can feel like there are bad transits. A transit that people often think of as bad is like the Saturn return, which is everybody or between the ages of 28 and like 31. Saturn takes that long to move through the whole zodiac. So by that time, it's getting back to where it was when we were born. And Saturn is all about like discipline and restrictions and like growth and authority. So it can put a lot of like restrictions around you at that time, make things feel very like tense and constricted, but it's ultimately to grow. So like for an example,
growth is uncomfortable. Growth is uncomfortable.
You like someone could look at that transit and be like, oh, this is going to be a bad time in my life. Ew. Or they can look at it as this is going to be a really good time for me to see possibly whatever has been limiting my growth and to really put the work in to overcome it.
Right. I am fluctuating right now because we have an impending Saturn return coming upon us. I'll like fluctuate from, oh, this is going to be great. I love being uncomfortable. I'm going to blossom to, oh my God, I'm horrified. What's going to happen? What if nothing happens?
Yeah,
what if nothing changes? What if it's all internal? Internal's fine.
Because internal growth is terrible.
Internal's fine.
Yeah. And I think that's like this of knowing anything, there is the dark side of then worrying about it. And I think that's been like a big challenge for me with astrology, is like to kind of hold it loosely. because as I mentioned earlier with the obsessiveness, what that can also be is like holding to something for a sense of certainty, and this idea that like you have some insight into and especially when you know astrology really well, like you have some insight into what kind of energies and events might be upcoming for you and what you might be dealing with, but then that can sometimes take you out of the present. So kind of like being aware of how much is this calming to you, because it can be calming. It can be like, hey, this time maybe I'm not experiencing success in this particular area of my life, but that's because I'm supposed to be focusing on this other area. Like that can give you a zoomed out perspective and like help you be more present. But it can also be like, all right, I'm just waiting for this other time when I can focus on this, and that's not necessarily as healthy.
I mean, this is making me think of one thing you said to me that really like put it into perspective, where if like planets wise, if it's favoring, let's just say, family or communication, it's opposing the other one. So it's going to cause tension in this other side of your life. So it just emphasizes that we're not perfect. It's impossible to be perfect. There's always going to be an area in your life where you feel like you're either not giving enough attention to, there's not enough going on in it. It feels like a dumpster fire. Who knows? Something. But that, like, putting it in perspective that way, it does feel calming. It's just kind of like it's impossible to have it all figured out, have it all like
right.
Put your attention all the areas of your life.
Yeah. And like something I like to say to myself is like, you can have it all, but not all at once.
Oh. Oh, John, I love that.
As you know, this is something I frequently need to remember. Because
I like how we started this with you listing all your interests. I feel like that really gave some perspective.
Yeah. And I think
it's a play, do burlesque, give astrology readings.
Exactly. And I think it can give you permission to explore. This is something that astrology has definitely done for me, is I feel like it's given me permission to be more than one thing. Because my birth chart is very like, I have planets in many, many different signs. And it's
chaotic.
Chaotic, yeah. That's a word for it, I guess. And it's like, well, in order to achieve a sense of balance in myself, like I have to honor all these different parts of me. But again, like you can't do that. It's impossible to do that all at once.
Right. So, John, when you're giving a reading, do you feel like you try and emphasize this to your clients as well? Like, how do you emphasize that there are no bad transit, that there are no bad placements? How do you really make them feel, not hopeless? The Virgos out there sometimes. I don't know. I really feel.
Tell me how you feel about Virgos. Tell me.
I feel like it's just hard. I've come to empathize with the Virgos. I am not a Virgo, but I've come to empathize with the Virgo energy because I do kind of feel like they get a little bullied.
I say this, but they were bullied in my play.
Yeah, they were bullied in your play. They were bullied everywhere. But like stuff like that, like, transits, planetary placements that seem unfavorable. How do you make people feel comfortable?
I mean, I think it's about like showing people what the gift in that is. And I think I maybe come to this with a unique perspective because I have some planetary placements that are not very favorable. Like I have Venus in Virgo, which is a sign that when it's in its fall. I have a Venus and Mars square, which is difficult. I have Saturn on my ascendant, but through like accepting the lessons in these things and accepting that like this is an area where I'm maybe going to struggle more than other people, but because of that I'm going to achieve a greater kind of wisdom in it and a greater level of like empathy in it. I think that is and I think this is sort of a lesson of like most spiritual practices, to the extent that astrology is a spiritual practice, is that it's really through the things that you struggle that you find like your greatest gifts and your greatest talents and like your greatest strength. And people who struggle with very little tend not to be very wise,
Evolved.
evolved people. And I think it's about kind of finding, there's a Khalil Gibran quote. I'm just like saying, I'm saying aphorisms all day. But it's something like, the deeper the sorrow is carved into your soul, the more joy you can contain. And I think that that has been like, especially as I've gotten older, now that I'm 28 and approaching the Saturn return, and like approaching this time in everyone's life that is about a greater wisdom and maturation, it's interesting to sort of look around and feel that, because like I have Saturn close to my ascendant, which would be a placement that means you deal with Saturn's lessons early and they're kind of always present for you, is that as I'm coming to this point in my life, like I see that in certain ways I feel much more equipped to handle it than the people around me. And that because of that, I'm able to provide like more support to them and kind of like flourish through it. But 7 years ago, it felt like an incredible burden. So I think I try to like bring that perspective of my own lived experience to the readings, so that people leave feeling like if there's a challenging placement, there's something they can do with it that actually is very hopeful. And it's often like the people who have the most difficult charts that I resonate the most with, because they're the people who have really like lived very full and complex lives. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like everything you're saying seems like astrology has been incredibly healing and sort of helped with sort of self-acceptance and like maybe like explain some things for you. But how do you feel? Do you want to talk more about that, or how it's helped you sort of blossom, self-actualize into this amazing person that you are?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing has been like accepting my limitations in certain ways. That's a tricky balance, because I also never want to like, I think with any like system, I sort of alluded, it's very good to hold it loosely. And so like accept the limitation, like if astrology is saying like, oh, this is an area that you might struggle more in, and you feel empowered by that knowledge and feel like, okay, this is maybe something where I can take a different approach that feels more aligned with me instead of like what society maybe dictates. Awesome. But if it starts to feel like, oh, astrology says I'm limited in this area, so I am cursed to suffer forever, then maybe step away from astrology a little bit.
Yeah.
But because, and I guess like examples of that I can think of, like for a period of time, I've had a lot of planets moving through my 12th house. And that has been
the 12th house.
Sorry.
Explain the 12th house.
The 12th house is like a house of like solitude and retreat and isolation. In some schools of astrology, it's called the house of self-undoing. The house of hidden enemies. It's like where basically it's the house that's farthest from the rising sign, the house that's farthest from the self. So it can often like occupy things that we can't see that maybe like get in our way, and this can be our own like self-sabotage. So
I do have a question. Is it, I forget what school of astrology this is, where it's like the first house is right above the horizon, the 12th house is right below.
So the first house,
right, the house of self,
right,
be right above the horizon, and then the 12th house is going to be right below the surface, or no?
So the first house is like, typically it's like the first through the sixth houses are actually like below.
Oh, below.
These are like,
interesting.
right. And it's kind of, it gets it makes sense, sort of makes logical sense with the other, because like the first, second, third, fourth, I'm trying to like, how do I summarize this quickly? So like there's the house of the self. And then the second house is like values, money, like food. It's things that like, what do you need to survive? It's like you have a body, how do you keep that body alive? And then the third house is sort of like communication, and like, so how do you then evolve to the point of speech? And then the fourth house is like home and family. So that's typically the lowest point of the chart, because it is like the thing that is most private and the thing that was like sort of the foundation of us. And then there's the fifth house, which is about like play and creativity, which actually I'm thinking this out loud in the moment. But if the fourth house, like if that home family provides a solid, secure foundation, then that creates a safer space for like play and creativity. And then there's the sixth house, which is kind of like the work, the day-to-day habits, health, fitness, but also kind of the work that you don't want to do. And then it's like out into the world. So seventh house is like, then it becomes about other people more. Seventh house is about partnership. Eighth house is like the money you share with other people. Ninth house is like big ideas, foreign travel. Then the 10th house is the highest point, and that's like the career and the reputation. 11th house is like friends, colleagues, associations. And then the 12th house is the house of like the unconscious, the things you can't see, the undoing, but sort of in the sense that like, that's kind of where we merge with the masses, where we kind of like lose ourselves in like the masses.
Interesting.
So it's sort of like the first house is the horizon, kind of almost.
Okay.
But that is the cusp of the first and the 12th house.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was, because to me the 12th house seems more internal, like it's to the underworld. I just imagined it was lower. That's so interesting.
I mean, I think also like a way to think about it, like the underworld really contains all these other people. Because I often, well, not often, but I wonder how much like
I often wonder about the underworld.
I wonder like how much the 12th house really has to do with us. And I've said this to you, I feel like the 12th house is kind of other people's projections onto us.
Yeah.
So I think that's also why it can be a place where we lose ourselves, because we lose ourselves in like other people's expectations and like the ghosts of like past ideas of ourselves.
Yeah. How did we get here?
I have no idea.
Like
I was like saying something else and then I lost it, but this feels more interesting.
Yeah.
I was talking about 12th house transits.
Oh, okay.
Because so I had a period of time that I had a lot of transits in my 12th house, and this also coincided with like quarantine. So that made sense. There's a lot of isolation. But then like to a certain extent, it was comforting because I didn't necessarily have the same kind of energy that I have at other points in my life. Not as much was happening. Like it felt like a time where I was kind of being pushed to like retreat more and be more internal. And even like if I would overexert myself, like I would have like physical symptoms and things. Like I was getting clear like messages like not to do that. But at the same time, like I had to be careful to not feel like, oh, I shouldn't go have this experience because now it's supposed to be a time of like retreat and secrecy.
Right.
And to still like push myself to do the things that were of value to me. So I guess that this was an answer to a question that I don't remember anymore. But that's
yes. Oh, it was the question about self-acceptance through astrology, self-actualization, and self-healing.
Yeah. Because I think a big mistake that people who know a lot about astrology make is and I see this a lot, and is that it becomes this like limiting belief of like, now is not a good time to do this, so I shouldn't do it. And it's like, you can hold the knowledge that like now might not be the best time to do this, but also ultimately honor your intuition. Because what I'm surprised often by is like looking back at a transit, and it actually did manifest in a very literal way, but I wasn't like, if I had thought of it the way I thought of it at the beginning, I maybe wouldn't have made the decisions that ultimately allowed it to manifest in the way it did, because it was literal, but it was still surprising to me.
Mm. And like, so finding the balance between, you know, being astrologically informed and knowing where the planets are, knowing where the moon is,
Mhm.
but not letting it control your life.
Yeah.
How do you feel, like, do you feel impacted daily by the moon? Or you don't pay so much attention to that? Like, you're more looking for the transits. Like, a piece of advice, if you could give anyone a little piece of advice for astrology that isn't just learn your rising sign, because that's what you need. That's what the horoscopes are about. Another tidbit.
A tidbit like about transits specifically, and
No.
anything.
Yeah, what else do you think is like valuable to know? That's like maybe it's the second step from getting your ascendant or rising sign.
I think for whatever reason, the
Is
thought
something coming to you?
something's coming to me. I feel like I have several answers, but the one that I'm going to share, the one that's surprising me the most.
Mm.
I think it's helpful to know about like the essential dignity of planets. And so the essential dignity is the idea that certain planets function better in certain signs, or function more, better is not the right word, function more in the way that they're socially expected to.
I like this.
So like, for example, I'll use the sun. The sun the sun rules Leo. So if you have a Leo sun, it's probably going to be very easy for you to access like self-esteem and your ego and like self-promotion in a sense. And then the sun is exalted in Aries. So if you have an Aries sun, again, like very positive, very easy to have that self-esteem. And then in the opposite signs, they would not have as much dignity. So the sun would be the opposite of the rulership is the detriment. So the sun would be in detriment in Aquarius. And the reason for that is like Aquarius is sort of about all of humanity. So it's not so much about individuating, which the sun wants like individuate. And then it would be in its fall in Libra. And the reason for that is like Libra is about the balance between the self and the other. So again, like that can make individuation difficult. A benefit to knowing this is that, and actually maybe the sun is not the best example for me to use because I don't have that many Libras and Aquariuses in my life. But I think a benefit to knowing this is like, okay, as a Leo, I might have an easier time like something that becomes very important to me as I go about my life is how do I make choices that contribute to my self-esteem? And that becomes like a motivating factor. But that might not necessarily be the way other people navigate their lives. So because this is something that's easier for me, I should have the knowledge that, okay, this is an easier thing for me and I shouldn't expect everybody else to have access to this like idea in the same way. And maybe I can offer it to them in a way that feels beneficial to them, but also not force it on them like, oh, this is easy. Whereas if I had like the sun in Libra, I maybe have a different understanding of why individuation can be difficult for me and realize that maybe my strength lies in finding my individuality in the way it balances out with the people around me.
Ooh.
I'm glad you responded to that because I felt a little like I lost my way halfway.
No, I think it landed for all the Libras.
Should I give another example of essential dignity that might help clarify it a little bit?
Yeah, maybe like one of the outer planets.
The outer planets? That's interesting. Do I want to do, let's do Saturn.
There we go.
So Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. And a good way to think about this is Saturn traditionally, in the planets you can see visually, because you can't see past Saturn, was the furthest from the sun. So it rules the signs that happen at the coldest points of the year, Capricorn and Aquarius. And so Saturn is about limitations, responsibility, restriction. People who have Saturn in Capricorn and Aquarius, and these are signs that are just very good at like, I'm going to follow the responsibilities. I'm going to put the work in, X to Y to Z. I'm fine with like long-term goals. I can see that far ahead. Awesome. And then Saturn is exalted in Libra. So this is actually interesting because what you kind of see is like Saturn does well in the signs that the sun does not, because Saturn is very far from the sun.
Yeah. Okay.
So if Saturn is about like responsibility, Libras are very conscious of our responsibility to other people, hyper conscious of it. So people who have Saturn in Libra might naturally have an access to the kind of like fairness and consideration that Saturn requires. Where Saturn is not going to function as well is in Aries, which is Saturn would be in its fall in Aries. That's because Aries can be very like impulsive and a little reckless, and Saturn is all about like planning things through. So for people with Saturn in Aries, that can be, it can be even more of a challenge to learn those lessons around the Saturn return.
Interesting.
And then like, sorry.
No, I was just going to sum up. So basically, other than knowing the ascendant, people should know what the ruler of each sign, essentially, and then the ruler of each sign, the planetary. Oh my God, John.
They should know it. Basically, if you have any planets that are dignified, which means that they're either in the sign that they rule or they exalt, if you have any planets that are in detriment or debilitated, which would mean that they're either in fall or detriment. So I have the sun in Leo, that's exalted, it's in the sign that it rules. I have Venus in Virgo, it's in its fall. So Venusian things, love, relationship can be a bit of a challenge. But my ego is very strong through it all. But I think the gift of that is also that like having a planet in its fall, I don't necessarily go about relationships the way I think I'm going to sum this up in a way that I think is good. I think that what I'm learned over the years is that because I have this planet in its fall, I'm a lot more conscious in the way that I use it and the way that other people use it, because I can't necessarily go about it in the way that's necessarily socially expected of me. So like if you're thinking about love and relationships in the way that that would be socially expected, it's that there's a lot of ease and like romance and that kind of connection is just flowing and easy. And people with Venus and Virgo are hyper analytical and can sort of see everything that's happening. But I think that what comes out of that is there's a real awareness of the dynamics that come into play in relationships, and that can then make the approach to them very like ethically minded, because it has to be so conscious. But in order to achieve like the higher expression of that, you have to be aware that you're moving through it differently than the way that's socially expected of you. So you're not constantly in resistance to that.
And you're learning. It takes time.
Does everyone watching see how Stephanie knocked me down?
It takes time. No, it takes time. There are some placements in my chart that you well know I am still like working on not feeling annoyed by it, and like being like, how do I embrace this? How do I actually find the good in this? How does this shift my perspective here? Yeah, so interesting. So, question, John.
Mhm.
As an astrologer, I feel like all of a sudden I feel like I'm like this is a game show. Like I lost it in a way. For the last 10 points, I have a
Who wants to be a millionaire?
my question is, so as an astrologer, what has been one of the most rewarding moments in like in a session or something a client told you or just yeah, a moment that really stands out for you without revealing anything. Like I'm not asking for details about anybody, but
Huh. I think there was a, how do I reveal this without revealing any details?
I could bleep it out.
No, I don't. I think it's a general enough experience that no one would be able to identify who it was.
Mhm.
There was a client that was sort of she was at a period of like great change in her life and was just about to make like hmm. Maybe I can't say it without revealing it, but so it's just going to sound very general. It was someone who was at a period of great change and was like, I don't know if I'm making the right decision.
Mhm.
And then looking ahead at their chart, I was able to see like, well, it looks like these are really like prime moments for major life changes to happen. And then reached out to me a few months later and was like, these major life changes all happened
Wow.
pretty much exactly when they were predicted to.
Mhm.
And I think that in like seeing clients, I think that's been the wild thing to me is like I will tell people something about their life having never met them before and they will be like, yeah, that happened exactly then. And that is kind of eerie also. um because it could also give like if you give me your birth date and time, you've really given me like very much information about you, so be careful.
Yeah, don't reveal this so nonchalantly.
Right. Because like it's often like I have there's another example that comes up where I was like from several placements in your chart and getting a sense that you struggled in with this very specific thing as a child, and they were like, yeah, I did.
Mm.
um so I think like, okay, yes, that can be eerie, but I think it makes people feel very seen, because it makes them feel that their life has been going according to some kind of like plan and alignment, and they haven't been moving totally out of step with the alignment of who they are, um, when something so true of them can be reflected back to someone that's never met them before.
Mm. Yeah.
I'm glad that landed because I feel like I'm just rambling, trying not to reveal
It just
information.
feels validating.
Yeah.
I think like it's like an astrology reading. Like I've gotten a reading from you, I've gotten a reading from other people. It just feels validating every time. Um and so it feels both validating and it's someone else giving you the reading. So they're being kind. Like if I were gonna let's just say all of a sudden I had all the astrological knowledge and for the first time I was going to read my chart and I read something and like that, you know, the Virgo somewhere in me and I would be full judgment.
The Virgo in you would be judging the Virgo in you.
It would be very meta. But point being, someone reflecting it back to you is emphasizing the good qualities too, where sometimes we don't have that same amount of kindness to ourselves. Um, like you've gotten readings from other people too that have like shifted your perspective about certain placements and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's also I think it's important to get readings from a couple different people. Like
Mhm.
because everyone's bringing different information, everyone's bringing like different perspectives to each placement,
And
which
also people read a chart through the lens of their own experience. And
yes,
I'm sure there are
exactly.
astrologers that say that they will say that they don't do that, but I don't think that's possible.
Yeah, it's impossible to be unbiased.
Right. Because also if like somebody has a placement that I have, I'm gonna have a different kind of information about that.
Mhm.
It's going to be a more like it's going to be like, I know what it's like to live with this, but it's not necessarily going to be as objective
Yeah.
as a placement that I don't have any experience with.
Mm. Yeah. And so like, how do you feel like astrology has informed the other parts of your life? The burlesque, the playwriting, the poetry writing, the songwriting, all of it.
It hasn't. No, I'm kidding.
You're objective always.
I am completely divided in my selves and they don't communicate at all. I mean, I think one, it's the sense that it's given me permission to do these different things.
Mm.
Because it's also like, okay, I have these things, I have these placements, how am I going to express them?
Mhm.
And I think, like, for example, knowing that I have a Sagittarius midheaven. So knowing that like I'm going to feel most empowered in my public image and like in my reputation, my career, if I present something that makes people feel like liberated from the constructs of society. What's something that might do that? Burlesque. But also even just like doing multiple different things, because I think a big like thing that we're fed in society is this idea that you can only be one thing or else you're going to confuse people.
Mhm.
And then like I think like for a long time I was very interested in academia, but my Mars and Gemini was very happy. But then other parts of me like didn't feel like as like my sun in Leo and didn't feel as physicalized, and like my moon in Pisces didn't feel like the emotions were getting expressed as much. And like if I'm just writing a poem, maybe like my Pisces moon will feel really like expressed. I think this is why like I consider my main genre to be playwriting, is because it kind of gives me the opportunity to bring all these different parts in.
Mhm.
And is also probably why like it's helpful to write several characters, because they can all embody like different parts of you. So yeah, I think just having the awareness of what I'm strong at, and like the power of bringing that together is empowering.
Mm. You're a multifaceted human being, John.
Thank you. As are you.
Thank you. But so as your
Otherwise, I wouldn't be your friend.
yeah, I mean, well, really, let's be honest.
Not to say that I like all kinds of people.
Of course, of course, of course. We're all complex.
We're all complex.
Yes.
I think it's one of the gifts of our friendship is I think that we are both people that honor our complexity and wrestle with our complexity, and seek to like discover more and more about it as we live our lives, and like share more or share what we discover with the world. And I think, I think a lot of people are afraid of their complexity. And it's nice to spend so much time with someone who empowers it in me and seeks me out to also empower it in her.
You're gonna make me cry.
You're gonna make me cry.
So since I'm almost making you cry, let me ask you this. What advice would you give your younger self? If you could speak to him now with how far you've come, with everything you know, with this knowledge that you are this complex. I see the this complex being that, astrology has helped you sort of not define, but sort of understand a little more fully. What advice would you give to little John?
What age are we talking to?
6.
Uh-huh. I mean, I would say that I would say this already.
Mm.
And I think actually like the gift of astrology has been, if the idea is you're returning to your like birth chart, to your natal, like what you were from the beginning, it's kind of like clearing out all the other like gunk and experiences and trauma and imprinting and social expectations that got in the way of that, to return to this like very sensitive, very performative, very flamboyant, very curious and enthusiastic, but also like kind of observational person that I was then, who didn't like, I don't have memories of myself at that time being like, oh, I shouldn't be this way. Like that, all that comes later. And it's just sort of like, when you return back to that place, that like childlike place, you have a lot more power and agency in your life because you're operating more automatically from a place that's like authentic to you. So you're able to more easily recognize your needs and ask for them and receive them.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was also getting teary. Because like as you were explaining it, like a return to literally the imprint in the sky of
Right.
that moment of birth. It's like return to self in
Yeah.
the purest form, in that one moment where nothing had like affected you. Like this is who you are. And
one of the books that I highly recommend, it's a predictive astrology book by Bernadette Brady for like interpreting transits and things. I think it's called The Eagle and the Lark.
I will get.
She talks about like the birth chart as like an instrument, and the transits come and they're like tuning that instrument. So it's sort of like when a transit hits a certain part of your chart, it is bringing you more in tune with yourself. So you're going to struggle more with a transit if you resist yourself. So it's actually sort of like, it's kind of all about a returning.
Mm.
Which also is kind of liberating, because then the lesson that you need to learn is actually one that somewhere within you already know.
Yeah. You were born with the lesson.
Mm-hmm.
I also love that, like, in this moment, Raven was just giving me dead eye contact. Like, this is the truth.
Let it sink in.
It's like, no, not really. I feel like that's a perfect place to end this. Mm-hmm. Unless, oh wait, John, no, there's one more thing. So how can people get readings with you? I'm gonna link your stuff, but how is it set up? How long are the readings?
So the readings are an hour if you just do the birth chart. I would not recommend just doing predictions. Just because in order to understand like predictions, you kind of need the framework of your chart and who you are. So it's an hour to just do the birth chart. It's an hour and a half to do the birth chart with predictions. And then if you're like a returning client and want to just do predictions, that'd be like an hour. And if you just DM me on Instagram, which is at John Patterson Official, because I'm the only official John Patterson in the whole world. Everyone else is a fraud.
Yep.
And then, yes, if you just DM me if you're interested in booking a reading, and then we'll set that up. I would need your birth date, time, and place. I highly recommend trying to get as exact a time as you can, just because, especially with some of the especially if you're doing predictive, some of the techniques I use are like very sensitive to birth time. So if you want to get like more distilled into what date certain kinds of things might happen, you would want that information.
I still remember that time I thought I was born 30 minutes earlier than I am.
Right. And
And I
it's
was.
it's completely changed your self-perception.
And then it was like, wait, no, John, that's a whole lie.
You were not yet ready to really be known.
No, I wasn't. John, it's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
I'm gonna stop recording, but we're gonna stay on.
Okay.
Oh, here.